Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
The elections are finally over. And as the dust settles, the pundits are all weighing in on what Narendra Modi 3.0 might do or not do. Are his wings clipped? Or is that saying too much too soon? What pound of flesh will each coalition partner demand? But what some other commentators are also saying is that no matter how the NDA governs, perhaps this election result will mean a more spirited opposition that can hold the government accountable, a less compliant media, and a stronger judiciary even. Surely the lawyers for the BK16 might hope so. BK16 is the name for the activists, some of them academics, poets, trade unionists, human rights activists, Dalit organizers, who were all swept up as urban Naxalites on charges of conspiracy after unrest broke out at a Dalit gathering in Bhima Koregaon in 2018. Since then, their lawyers say sections of the press have conducted a media trial to whip up outrage against them. Judges have recused themselves from bail hearings over and over again. One of those arrested, a Jesuit priest in his 80s with Parkinson's, has died since then. While many are now out on bail, they still haven't had their day in court. While the story has been covered in bits and pieces, Alpa Shah has for the first time put the pieces together in a book and uncovered some new ground that might affect their fate. Alpa Shah is a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics, and the book is called The Incarcerations, Bhima Koregaon and the Search for Democracy in India. And she joins us on the show. Alpa Shah, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Sandip. Thank you.
Before we go into what happened at Bhima Koregaon in 2018, could you just explain the significance of that place in Dalit history?
Oh, it's a fascinating place. I had not heard about it before I began working on the book. And I gather that most of the BK16 hadn't heard of the place before they found themselves, implicated in violence in Bhima Koregaon on the 1st of January 2018. It was a 200th anniversary of a battle, which is called the Battle of Koregaon, which Dalits these days celebrate as their victory over upper castes in India. In 1818, on the 1st of January, Dalits were part of an army which fought against the Peshawar Maratha Empire, an upper caste empire. And, this notorious empire under which Dalits were really treated awfully, had to wear a kind of spittoon under their necks to catch the saliva that may fall on the land that would pollute, the land that Brahmins were to walk on, or they had to, wear a broom on their back so as to brush away their footsteps, so that this whole the untouchability of Dalits was very, very sharp. And so the Dalits fought this battle against the Peshawar army and they won. And so today, Dalits reincarnate that battle saying, caste oppression is still going on in India. And, they use it as a moment of Dalit solidarity and Dalit pride to, strengthen the contemporary fight against caste oppression. So the interesting thing about this battle is, although Dalits now claim it as their own battle, how was it that the Dalits were fighting an upper caste army? So the interesting thing is that they were actually a regiment in the British Army, the East India Company. The British Army had lots of regiments. It was made up of, lots of Indian soldiers which fought battles across the world. And in India, there was a Mahar regiment. And the Mahar regiment, many Dalits joined it as a way to get out of the caste oppression of their villages. Joining the army allowed a bit of social mobility. It allowed you to have, education facilities for your children. And, Dr. Ambedkar, who drafted the Indian Constitution, his family was a product of, being in that, much of his family had been in the Mahar regiment. And that's, partly explains his upward mobility, his ability to come to the LSE and study there and to Columbia and study there. So the British built a memorial there to consolidate their victory. It was their victory, of course, over the upper caste Peshawar Empire, the Maratha Empire, which enabled them to actually gain control of most of northern India. It was one of the last battles of the British Army before the British ruled over India. So the British put this memorial up, which you can go and see today in Bhima Koregaon. It's this like obelisk, like an Egyptian obelisk in the middle of, on the banks of the river Bhima at Koregaon. And there's a plaque on the memorial. And if you read the plaque on the memorial, what you see is there were, all these English soldiers who were listed there, but there were also these Dalit soldiers who were listed there. And of course, so Ambedkar went there way back and, he recognized the significance of this place and significance of Dalits having fought this battle. And he said we should celebrate this place as a place where Dalits fought the Peshawar army and won against them.
And Alpa, so basically also the reason many upper castes were upset, many of the Hindutva forces were upset about this, is exactly the Dalits were celebrating this victory, but it was couched as, look, why are you celebrating the victory of what essentially was a British army over a native Indian one, right?
Exactly. And they're like, this is like dividing Indians. We need unity, of course. And there's also the upper caste part of it, right? Like the fight against the upper castes, which was also not appreciated. So if you actually read Golwalkar, the second RSS Supremo, who was, one of the main ideologues of the RSS. He has his speeches and his writings in various books. And there's a passage on this memorial and the Dalit celebration of it, where he says, that this has to be stopped and this is actually dividing Indians and where, we need unity and this is actually against the upper castes. And so, it's been a kind of long-standing issue for the Hindutva forces. And over the last many years, before the 2018 attacks, they had been mobilizing around it.
So what do we know initially about what happened in 2018 at the Bhima Koregaon commemoration?
I was fortunate to interview for the book Anita Savale, who was a Dalit activist, a Dalit woman from Pune, who was one of the people that was going to this celebration, had been going to it for a number of years. And this year, what happened was she was there, she went with her kids and her husband and some friends, and they arrived on their motorbikes, going to Bhima Koregaon from Pune. And her friend, got lost in the crowd. And then she got this panic call from her friend saying, I'm scared. I'm in the middle of these riots and, we're being attacked and, come and do something. And so Anita Savale kind of went to this place and she talked to the police, and the police were like very quite unhelpful and actually led her into those riots, and Dalits found themselves being attacked. There were rocks being thrown at them from rooftops. There were Molotov cocktails being thrown. The people were being beaten. And it was, these men waving the saffron flag of Hindutva who were attacking them. And so Anita Savale managed to escape, sought refuge in a hospital and managed to escape. But many people were injured. And one person, Rahul Fatangale, died as a result of this violence. Many Dalit restaurants and shops were set on fire. People lost their homes and, been afraid to return. So it so happened that a band had been declared, a kind of lockdown of Bhima Koregaon before. And there were these Hindutva guys who were basically going around saying that we have to make sure that this celebration doesn't happen this year. There are videos of like cars being set alight. And then the next few days, the Dalits kind of protested against this violence and the inaction of the state against the attack on Dalits. And Anita Savale herself was part of a protest in Pune. Actually, she filed an FIR, a first information report, with the Pune police, the rural police, saying, that this happened and that she said that the crowd was chanting the names of two men. And these men were Milan Ekbore and Sambhaji Pire, who are, known people in Maharashtra who have been leading various kind of Hindu right movements, like cow protection movements, for example. And Milan Ekbore was actually arrested in the first instance because of Anita Savale's FIR. However, a month later, he was released. And soon a whole set of other investigations began, which leads
to your book, literally. Yeah. And I should mention here that one of the things, it's interesting you bring up the story about interviewing Anita for your book, because it seems that after the narrative changed and the investigation went away, it was taken from the Pune Rural Police to the Pune City Police. Nobody interviewed Anita anymore.
They even tried to say, that she has removed this case, and they put out false information. And Anita herself then self-recorded messages, and put them out in the local kind of news channel saying, I haven't withdrawn the case and I haven't withdrawn my FIR. I stand by everything I say. And when I interviewed her for the book, there's a whole chapter on what actually happened at Bhima Koregaon. And, she recounted everything to me to go on record that this is what happened and this is how it happened. And this is what I said. And she still wants justice. She's a very brave woman. There have been consequences for her for speaking out and continuing to speak out. Yeah.
So tell us what happened after about a month. What was the new narrative that was put out?
So the new narrative was spread, across national news channels in India. And that was that, there is this group of people who have incited violence at Bhima Koregaon, and look, they are really dangerous. They are actually urban Naxalites. They're Maoist terrorists. And look, they've even been plotting to assassinate the Prime Minister Modi. And this narrative went out as a result of raids that the Pune City Police conducted all over the country in one go. They raided the houses and offices of a group of intellectuals, professors, lawyers, poets, artists, trade unionists, in Delhi in the north, in Hyderabad in the south, in Ranchi in the east, in Mumbai in the west, in Goa, all over the country. And they conducted these raids simultaneously, and they took the electronic devices of all the people that they raided. So they took their phones, they took their computers, they took their USB keys, and this was the main thing that they were interested in. And then they claimed that they had found incriminating evidence on some of their electronic devices, which then justified a series of incarcerations that took place over the next couple of years. So first there were 5 people arrested, Surendra Gadling, Dalit human rights lawyer, Shoma Sen, a professor of English literature at Nagpur University, Sudhir Davale, a Dalit poet and publicist, Rona Wilson, a prisoners' rights activist, and Mahesh Raut, 31-year-old, forest rights activist. Mahesh Raut was the youngest. He was just in his early 30s. And then, then there was a next round of arrests, which took place later on in the year, under which Sudha Bharadwaj, a trade unionist, human rights lawyer who works in Chhattisgarh, was put in jail. There was Stan Swami, an 83-year-old Jesuit priest who had worked for indigenous rights, for the 30 years previously in the state of Jharkhand. Actually, he was not put in jail then. He was put in jail a bit later. But there was Gautam Navlakha, who had done long-standing work on the atrocities, human rights atrocities in Kashmir, but also in central and eastern India. He was put in jail. Varvara Rao, an above 80-year-old or nearing 80 when he was arrested, a revolutionary poet from Hyderabad, was put in jail then, was arrested then. So there were 5, then there was the next lot, and then over the next few years, there was 16 people, the last of which was Stan Swami, the Jesuit priest I told you about. BK16, they are now, known as the Bhima Koregaon 16.
And in fact, Alpa, you say in the book that Stan Swami called somebody to say, what is Bhima Koregaon?
Yeah, he called his lawyer. So these people were interrogated, right, by the police before they were arrested in Stan Swami. Stan Swami was interrogated over many days. So first the Pune Rural Police was investigating with Anita Savale. Then the Pune City Police took over the case and had this whole set of other arrests of this group of people we've just been talking about. Then the NIA took over the case at some point. The National Investigation Agency, which is the central anti-terror task force under the direct leadership of, the Home Secretary.
The Home Minister.
The Home Minister, yeah.
And we should mention, Alpa, that NIA took it over as soon as there was a government change in Maharashtra.
Absolutely. There's been clear signs that there's something is very wrong in how this evidence has been collected, and many questions were raised about it. And when the government changed in Maharashtra away from the kind of BJP-led alliance under Devendra Fadnavis, the then chief minister, the new government said, we have to look into this case, that actually the police action in this case is quite questionable, that we have to have an independent investigation into it. This case was whipped away from the Maharashtra police, and it was taken into the control of the NIA.
When the police had a famous press conference announcing these arrests, and they said all this stuff has been found, what was the kind of stuff they said had been found on these people's computers?
Well, they've claimed that they had found, letters, documents, which showed that they were Maoist terrorists, right? So they flashed these letters across Indian news channels. So they made the first round of arrests, and then they immediately held a press conference. So before there's any kind of trial, they just had a press conference flashing across national news the arrest of these urban Naxalites. And one of the letters they flashed was a letter which they claimed showed that the BK-16, or some of them, were plotting to assassinate the Prime Minister. It was a very, very strange letter. Many of us saw this letter as it was circulated across the media. And I saw it when the first arrest took place here in London, And for someone, my previous research, I'm an anthropologist. I spend a lot of time with the people I write about. And I've worked with Adivasi communities in Jharkhand and spent 4.5 years living amongst them. And the last 1.5 years that I spent, it was in a Naxalite guerrilla zone. So I spent a lot of time with Naxalite guerrillas who are just going in and out of all of those houses that I was living in amongst the Adivasis. And I learned a lot about them. I wrote a book called Night March about them. And one of the very interesting things is that, they take so much care in anonymizing everything. They anonymize names of people, but they importantly anonymize, things like ammunition. Like they'll never call guns, or they'll never call, bullets. It'll always be under some kind of pseudonym, like flour or sindoor. So you look at these letters, and these letters were about ammunition that has to be acquired, and you just think, this doesn't make any sense. No Maoist, especially not very senior leadership, which, would be writing a letter like this. So, and I know that there are many security analysts, like Ajay Sani, one of the top security analysts in the country. He also raised concerns about these letters at the time, and the Caravan magazine, raised concerns.
When these people who were arrested kept saying, we don't know what these letters and documents are, we didn't send them. What happened was this was sent for a forensic study to a company called Arsenal Consulting. Can you tell us about, you talked to also the people who were involved there. What did they find?
Well, Arsenal Consulting, is a cyber forensic company. They work on cases all over the world, and the legal defense, like the lawyers of the BK-16, said that, nothing added up. Their clients were completely denying, that they'd even seen any of these, that they didn't recognize anything. So they sent it to Arsenal Consulting. Mark of Arsenal Consulting basically said, we thought that this will be a very quick job for us. But 6 months later, his team was still working on those files. And what they found was astonishing. They found that not only had the computers, clone copies of the computers they received, been snooped on, not only had they been hacked, but also they found a serious case of evidence tampering, aka implantation of evidence on the computers that they analyzed. So they analyzed Rona Wilson, Surender Gatling, and then lastly Stan Swami. And Stan Swami's came much later, and Stan Swami was also raided much later than the earlier, Rona Wilson and Surendra Gadling's devices were taken first. And
Stan Swami was raided twice, though.
He was raided twice. In fact, it's a very interesting story because why was he raided twice? This whole part of, I shouldn't give away the whole narrative of the book, because it's quite thrilling and chilling and shocking, the implantation of evidence section of the book. And yeah, he was raided twice. The first time, I think he was raided twice because the first time the police realized they had the wrong computer, because at that time Stan's computer had actually gone off for some technical checks or something. And so they came to raid the computers which they knew that they had hacked, and of course, and on which they had implanted evidence. But the first one they raided was not the computer that had been hacked, because that computer had gone somewhere else. So they came back to get...
We should say allegedly. We don't know that allegedly. We don't know.
Allegedly, the computer that they had hacked Stan Swami's computer. That computer had gone off for servicing. And so they came back. And why did they come back? All arrows point to the fact that they got the wrong computer the first time, not the one that they had allegedly hacked, So, yes, of course, we do not know, everything for sure. But what the Arsenal Consulting found was also that the hacker, whoever was doing this, had got more and more sophisticated and had tried to kind of wipe out their footprints, which they hadn't done on Rona Wilson's computer and Surendra Gadling's computer. So they could see all of this, which is just, extraordinary.
Then after Arsenal Consulting released its stories, and I think the Washington Post does a story about it, and, this makes some news. Then there is another company that gets into it called SentinelOne. Who approached SentinelOne and why?
So I think this case has now become like an internationally really fascinating case for cyber forensic researchers, because they are, some of the top cyber forensic researchers are in the US, and they have conferences and, they talk about cases that they're working on. And so SentinelOne, through this, and, it's a small community. So SentinelOne heard about this case. And not because they knew anything about the BK16, not that they even knew anything about India, not that they cared about any of this, but it just, in terms of cyber forensic terms, it became cyber espionage or cyber warfare. It became really fascinating to them. So they got the clone copies that Arsenal had, and they started a different kind of analysis on them. So, Arsenal can only show that this has happened, right? That this implantation of evidence happened. The SentinelOne had the capacity to go beyond that, to figure out how it might have happened. So they did this research on it, which they create this metadata, so they kind of mine the metadata of this case and of these computers. And I'm not at all an expert at all. In fact, I know nothing about computers. So I can't explain to you all the technical details, but my ignorance maybe was helpful, because I could ask SentinelOne, who were kind enough to talk to me. They are top 2 researchers who worked on this case. Any of us can go and look on their website and find their report on this case, which is called Modified Elephant. And Modified Elephant, I was like, what modified elephant? What is modified elephant? I know about the elephants in the jungles of Jharkhand, but what is this modified elephant? And so they have a whole report, and I read this report. I couldn't understand any of it, so I tried to interview them. I managed to do that because there are some amazing cyber forensic journalists in the US who also covered this case. One guy called Andy Greenberg, who had reported on this case for The Wired. And so, as I was saying, this case has become interesting to all of these researchers because, I think the only other comparable case they had at the time was a Turkish case. So these guys work on Ukraine, they work all over the world. So yeah, they spoke to me about what their report actually meant in practice.
And so let's again get this straight. So from what Arsenal is saying, they're saying they found evidence that the computers had been tampered with, that malware had been introduced. So it's not just a case of somebody snooping in on what you're doing, but it is also a case that where someone can actively plant a document or a file onto your system, right? Is that pretty much correct?
Yeah, if you remember that there was this whole thing about Pegasus, this Israeli NSO spyware, which has been used to target, journalists, human rights activists, all kinds of people all over the world, and especially including in India. And there was a whole database that was found, through an international group in which many, many, many Indian activists, journalists, lawyers, I mean, they were all on this list. So all of these people, so the devices, the mobile phones that they analyzed had this NSA software. So yes, the snooping was a part of it. Hacking of computers, that's another thing as well, which can happen to any of us. The British Library here in London is down because of a whole hacker attack. It's basically you get a link through an email or to a website or something you don't know, you click on it and basically then your computer is hacked. That's part of snooping on you, right? And of course, hackers can take things from you. But here what they were doing is they were also putting things on these computers. So documents that, for instance, on Rona Wilson's computer, there were documents created on a Word file, a Word program, which he didn't have. So it was a
different version.
It was a different version of Word, and one that, he didn't have. So it's like, okay. So what they found is a case of not only snooping and hacking, but evidence being implanted. And, things like Stan Swamy, he had in a folder on his computer, within a folder, like a Russian doll. At the end was this implanted folder, a folder that Stan Swamy had never opened. And, they can see this on his computer. He's never opened that folder. So unlike the Sentinel-1 reports, these are very comprehensive reports. You can see the exact details of what they found. They are on websites. Yeah, there's 5 reports so far.
So the Sentinel-1 reports, you say they're looking at how it was done. But are they able to say who was behind it, which is, I guess, the million rupee pound dollar question? Or is that something you have to put a lot of twos and twos together to make some guess?
Yes. So the whole 20,000 word chapter in my book is basically trying to get to the bottom of exactly this question. I don't want to give away all the spoilers, Sandip, on the show, but yes, I have a conversation with them. They have a fair idea, but it's not spelled out in their reports because it's hidden behind words like modified elephant. So what is this modified elephant? Who is this? And one thing was very interesting that Andy Greenberg had already, they had given only an interview to Andy Greenberg, who is a US-based journalist. They haven't spoken to any Indian journalists. There's not only Sentinel-1, there's other people also working on this case. And so one of the things that had happened is, apart from, the implantation of evidence and all of that, the emails of all the BK16, the emails had been hacked, right? So Rona Wilson's email, for example, had been hacked. And when you hack someone's emails, what had happened is the recovery address on the back of your email, when, say you forget your password, you put in a recovery address on the back of your email, right? So that recovery address had been changed, and the recovery address had been changed to somebody in the Pune police. So there was that aspect of the story. And in Andy Greenberg's report, there were hints as to whose recovery address was put on that.
But here we also should say, Alpa, that because the recovery address was put to police officer XYZ of the Pune police, does not necessarily imply that police officer XYZ was doing the hacking, because whoever was hacking could have put his address there, right?
Absolutely. So for a while I thought, now I know who the person is, and Andy Greenberg hadn't named the person. He just said that person was, there at Rao's arrest, and he was there at the Pune police conference. And then I was searching through all the photos, and it's there's only one guy who was there at both, and then I was I know who it is. And then I talked to Andy Greenberg, is it this guy, and he hadn't been able to put his name in his report. So I said, I've guessed who it is, and he said, I'll check with my editor, and he checked with his editor, and then his editor said that, yes, you can name him. So in the book, I named this person. But then I had doubts in my own head, exactly the doubts that you have, which is this poor fellow, I mean, not that these guys are poor fellows, but, this guy is going around, running around the country, making these arrests, and when does he have even time to go behind, email addresses and make these changes? Does he even have the technological know-how, how to do it? I was okay, this doesn't add up, actually. So yeah, maybe this guy's name is there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he is the one that's, behind all of this. And so the same doubts that you had made me speak to the Sentinel-1 people again, And overnight, I came across, the night before I was interviewing them, speaking to them again, I came across a very fascinating report done by the Sunday Times and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism here in the UK. And they went to India undercover. They basically said that, we want to set up some kind of investigation agency and we need help, private investigators. And they basically uncovered what's happening in India, which is that there are all of these hackers who, you can hire if you want to snoop on your husband or if you want to think, your partner is cheating on you. Chris Mason, who's like a journalist, he has been hacked. Boris Johnson's. There's like all kinds of people have been, the Swiss leadership after the Qatar Games, Olympics, and there's various people who've been hacked. And where is it all happening from? How is it being done? And it's through India. Well, I didn't know it was through India. It was in the book, as I talk to you about I tell you about this conversation with Sentinel-1 and how we uncover where this is happening from and who might be behind it.
So it's possible that we don't know who's, if assuming that all of this did happen, that, whatever Arsenal and Sentinel are saying did happen, assuming that somebody might have ordered this, but then somebody might have hired this hacker for hire to do the actual hacking. So the roads might lead back to a hacker, but we still don't know as they say in X-Files, the cigarette smoking man is still behind the curtain, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a wonderful image. But yeah, and it might be the cigarette smoking men. One of the interesting things I found about it was that some of them had been hacked multiple times by multiple different actors. And fascinatingly, Rona Wilson was hacked from 2012. So that is before the current regime in power, which came into power in 2014. Another part of the story is that it's possible that, multiple people might be attempting to hack the same person for different reasons. And they might not even know, that the other part there's other people doing the same thing,
Mr. and Mrs. Smith. No, I mean, we're laughing, but it is utterly scary.
Hacking, of course, is the most advanced form. Well, no, I mean, implantation is the most advanced form, but yes, snooping and hacking kind of go hand in hand, The other thing, is that this technology exists and it's used probably by governments everywhere. But having the technology is one thing, using it and utilizing it is another. And then using it to implant evidence is another matter altogether, right? That's a step further.
And I want to get into a little bit about what you think about why this might have happened. But before that, since we talked about Pegasus, how does Pegasus fit into this? I mean, that story erupted, but I was unclear whether there was any evidence whether this malware that we're talking about was Pegasus or it was something else.
I don't know enough about it, but I think there's different things going on. So there's Pegasus definitely going on, which was found on, like, Rona Wilson's phone had Pegasus on it. So that's one thing that's on phones, and that's happened to many, many people across India. But then the hacking is a whole other thing. It's done using, these kinds of Trojan horses, which get into your computer, through which then things can be put on your computers. And netware, it's this malware called netware. And it's done by different kinds of hacker groups. And so we have, Rona Wilson was attacked by a number of different hacker groups. And how this whole infrastructure of hacking has developed in India, I think that's a whole other fascinating story.
So when these findings come out from about the fact that the computers might have been tampered with, that evidence might have been implanted and all of that, there are stories done. It sounds explosive. What was the judicial impact of that on all the... If this was a film, this would come out and that would be the end of the film.
The judicial response has been, these are foreign investigations. They hold no credibility in an Indian court, and this is the usual story, like, it's foreigners seeking to malign our country and malign India. They've just ignored them so far. But I'm hoping, at least, that this book actually puts the whole story together in a very, very powerful way. Because the problem is, of course, that the story hasn't been fully reported in the Indian press. And, hats off to all the journalists that have done bits and pieces of the story. But when you put the whole thing together, as the Incarcerations do, it is explosive. certainly the hacker for hire stuff like that has not been done in this way. So I'm hoping that, at least the book can be used by the lawyers in the courts now, even if separate investigations have to be initiated in India, and I think that should happen. Credible special investigations into what has happened in this case around the hacking and implantation of evidence is very, very important. And there is expertise in India, I believe, that can do this or work with foreign investigators as well. But there's a real need for this. It's important for the country at large because this can happen to literally anybody, right?
You talked to one of the police officers involved in the case. Some said they couldn't talk because the matter was sub judice. But when you told them about what you uncovered, did it give him many pause?
It was very interesting. I spoke to Shivaji Borke, who was leading the investigation in the Pune city police. So he was not the guy who was going around making the arrest, but the guy who was behind it. And as you say, it was a kind of a last resort call. Everyone I hadn't had any responses from any of the police officers, no responses to my emails. One of the guys, Shivaji Pawar, who was making the arrests, he said, sorry, ma'am, but, very politely, the matter is sub judice. Shivaji Borke was very fascinating. For me, that was I didn't expect to be interviewing him. I thought he'll put the phone down on me, but he spoke to me for 1.5 hours. And it was for him, this was how I took it was a moral project, that he really saw these guys as urban Naxalites, and it was his mission. And it was one of the greatest achievements of his life that he had put them in prison, and now, justice was done. And so when I mentioned arsenal, he said, arson? Arson who? And where is this arson? So he completely denied any of the revelations of the cyber forensic experts. And he also said, for them, it's very much about, this is a foreign agency. Who's going to listen to them here in India? We had a very polite and a very respectful conversation. And, I said to him, sir, you're not going to like the revelations of my book, and you're not going to like the book, But he was very courteous back. And, so we had this agreements and disagreements. And he said, I look forward to the book,
Have you heard from him yet?
No, I haven't.
And I think another thing I should mention when we're talking about the judicial response to it and all of that is, my understanding is because these people are targeted as Maoists and they are described as Maoists, and it goes under the UAPA and the NIA, that in many cases the judges also have their hands relatively tied until the trial actually begins, right? Until then is just one theory versus another theory, and they can't really do anything much.
Yeah, what's fascinating about this case is the number of judges that have recused, who have basically, when an application comes, when there's decision to be made, they just won't appear. And, they'll, and you can see what kinds of pressures they might be under. Gautam Navlakha just got bail. The Wire has done this piece around how judges are being changed around to hear these orders, and complete that's not normal practice. And so, you can see the serious issues in the judiciary in dealing with a case like this. And one of the fascinating things I found about this case is one of the first person to say that we should not be arresting these people, that dissent is a safety valve of a democracy. If dissent is not allowed, the pressure cooker can burst, There was a 3-judge bench that heard a petition that was filed by intellectuals in Delhi against the arrest of Sudha Bhardwaj and Varun Rao and Arun Ferreira and Vernon Gonzalez, in the second round of arrests. And Romila Thapar was the petitioner who led that petition, a professor of history, a very well-known professor of history in India. The judgment was, no, they have to go to prison. But one person dissented. And who was that person?
The current Chief Justice.
Absolutely. Yeah, the current Chief Justice, Justice Chandrachud. 6 years later, they are still in prison. Mahesh Raut, a 31-year-old forest rights activist, is still in prison. One person, Stan Swamy, died in custody. One of the reasons why I got fascinated to write this book, apart from the lives of the BK16, which we haven't talked about at all on this show, why they were really targeted, why they were so important. But apart from that, what this case this book was supposed to be a 60,000 word book. It became a 160,000 word book because what it shows is the multiple facets of the collapse of democracy in India. And some of the key pillars, which include, the media and how the media has handled this case and the judiciary.
So let's talk a little bit as we approach the end about the actual people involved. They were all people who worked on human rights in different ways. They may have known each. I don't know if they all knew each other, but some of them knew each other definitely. So could you talk a little bit about why you think some of them might have become such a thorn in the flesh?
Sandip, it's such a fascinating question, which occupies me for a lot of the book, So, yes, there were human rights activists, but there were human rights activists of a particular sort, right? If you dig deep into their lives, which I did, what you find is that they were all working for India's three main minorities, the rights of India's three main minorities. So there was Adivasis, indigenous people, Dalits, and Muslims. And people like Gautam Navlakha had been in Kashmir and had been working against atrocities against Muslims in Kashmir and then later worked on Adivasi issues in central and eastern India. With Adivasis, many of the BK16 were fighting the nexus between the state and corporations, multinational corporations, Indian-grown and, foreign, who have been working to take over Adivasi lands and forcibly, displace Adivasis for the minerals that lie under those lands. India's richest mineral reserves, coal, iron ore, bauxite, lie under those lands in central and eastern India. And historically, through the Indian constitution, but because of rebellions that Adivasis have fought in colonial times, British colonial times, against the takeover of their resources, they had won some rights to protect their lands. So in many areas of central and eastern India, only an Adivasi can buy the land of another Adivasi. So there has to be ways of, overcoming these protective laws. And there have been many attempts to kind of dilute those laws. But one of the things that has been happening in recent years has been these massive counterinsurgency operations in the name of clearing the forests of Maoists, in which many, many Adivasis have been imprisoned. The jails of central and eastern India are full of Adivasis imprisoned as alleged Naxalites, and these are very poor people. They will never have any legal representation. Their cases will never be heard. They'll just rot in jail. Stan Swami had filed a petition against the Jharkhand state for holding all of these prisoners without trial in prison for so long. And for him, it was, this was the reason he was a thorn in the flesh of the government. I think this was maybe one of the reasons, but it's a part of the story. Stan Swami, like Sudha Bhardwaj, had helped many Adivasi activists on the ground had helped them develop and fight, think about the Indian constitution, how the Indian constitution can be used to protect their land rights away from, the Gautam Adanis of the world trying to take over their land for their power plants. And they were quite successful at this. Sudha Bhardwaj, a very inspiring trade unionist who, at the age of 40 turned into a human rights lawyer, and she started to expand her trade union work to fight against the multinational mining companies who were polluting the land, using environmental litigation to stop this pollution, but also against the atrocities by state and counterinsurgency forces trying to, clear these Adivasi lands in the south of Chhattisgarh. And what you also see in these areas is, you'll see in the news, 40 Maoists killed in so-and-so place, in an encounter. And the Indian security forces will say that, it was all self-defense, but then you have these human rights activists who go out into those areas like Sudha Bhardwaj, and, they discover that actually they weren't all Maoists, that they were just ordinary villagers. And, in one famous encounter, which I cover quite in some depth in the book, is a Gadchiroli encounter in which, children were killed, children, going to a wedding were killed. Then there's the whole Dalit story, which is also, is related, but also separate. The BJP has been working very hard to get Dalits into the Hindu fold. The Dalit activists who have been incarcerated in this case, for example, Anand Teltumde or Sudhir Dhawale or Surendra Gadling or the poets, they were not all Dalits, but they were from lower caste, like Kabir Kala Manch activists, these cultural poets, they were all fighting against caste oppression. But what they were arguing is that the battle against caste oppression has to be a battle also against the multinational corporations, that the state and the multinational corporations are working hand in hand. We have to ally forces with Adivasis, with Marathas, so they were creating this cross-caste, cross-class alliance. So what we have here are the intellectuals of those movements, Anand Teltumde, probably one of the most important anthropologists of castes in India, who was arguing all of this in his writings. The Kabir Kala Manch, these very powerful poets who got huge audiences to all their performances in Maharashtra. So there were those particular kinds of Dalit activists arguing for these alliances and arguing against global capital, as well as, the kind of everyday caste oppression. So I think targeting these people, you're targeting basically anyone who works on Adivasi issues, on Dalit issues, on Kashmir and on Muslim issues in this way. So the BK16 got caught up in this case, but, this was a massive case which sent a big message to anybody working in any way in this way across the country, of which there are many, many people, that be careful, you're next. The democratic rights movements have been very prevalent at the grassroots level in India ever since the Indian emergency, People's Union of Civil Liberties, People's Union of Democratic Rights, which, PUCL was something that Sudha was leading in Chhattisgarh. PUDR was something that Gautam Navlakha was part of. PUCL, Jharkhand, Stan Swami was part of. So these movements have existed in India since the emergency, basically saying that we never want ever India to face what happened, during that emergency. These are the people who have been doing the silent but very important work in far corners of the country that most of us never hear about. Grassroots level work, but they also had national and sometimes international, voices. So this was a way of basically criminalizing and silencing all of these movements, all in one go, a vast section of society, 200 million Dalits, 100 million Adivasis, 200 million Muslims, through sending a message.
Is the lesson from this that activists who want to take on these kinds of issues are going to have to be much more tech savvy than they ever thought they needed to be?
I don't know, Sandeep, because we can't keep up with the technological developments. These people like Sudha, Bhardwaj, Stan Swami, they have so much important work to do on the ground. Even in the years in which, the arrests took place, the hackers got more savvy. They knew how to, erase their footprints. Like, how are we going to keep up with these developments? I think that the responsibility should not lie on their shoulders. They are doing important work, which they need to kind of carry on. But it should be on all the rest of us, to call into account the uses of these technologies, the ways in which our governments are allowing these processes to happen, the ways in which hackers for hires are not being regulated at all in India. I'm not sure about that question, to be honest.
You spoke to some of these activists. They are out on bail. You couldn't talk to them about the specifics of the case, but what did you learn from them about how they kept going on, when they were stuck in prison for so long? What gave them hope?
Well, I think the experiences are quite mixed. And I knew Stan Swami from my previous work in Jharkhand. Last time I met him, he couldn't lift a glass to his lips because his hands were shaking so much from his Parkinson's disease, And so it's just so shocking that an 83-year-old Jesuit priest during the COVID pandemic is sent to prison in Mumbai, a city he doesn't know at all. And, it's got so many ailments, and 6 months later catches COVID and then subsequently dies in judicial custody. And Stan Swami's experience, as I reconstructed it from his fellow co-prisoners, was very, he was hopeful. At first, he was hopeful. He was singing songs and writing. But then, these bail hearings kept, being postponed. He was denied medical bail despite his terrible health. He was denied bail to return to Jharkhand in his last days. He died of a heart attack, after the decision that he wasn't being given bail. And so it really took a big toll on him. But what I found working on this book, it is a tragic story, tragic story. But also it's a really hopeful story because these individuals are just so amazing and so hopeful. And as you rightly said, they're doing this work no matter who is in power. And they'd been doing this for years. And that is what they're doing in prison. I mean, Anand Teltumde, who I spoke to after he was given bail, I never spoke to any of them about the case because the matter is sub judice. But what I did talk to them is about their life histories. And I also talked where I could about their prison experiences. And Anand Teltumde wrote 4 books in prison. Sudha Bhardwaj, she was in 2 different prisons. First, she was in Yeravada prison in Pune, where she was in solitary confinement. And there, she actually wrote a book which has now been published called The Phansi Yard. She was in the hanging yard, of that prison. And the book is named after that. And it's the story of her fellow women prisoners. An incredible story, which has just won a book prize in India. Later on, she was transferred to Baikula jail in Mumbai, where she was living amongst many prisoners during the COVID pandemic. So she was not in solitary confinement. And there, what did she do? She was, an educated, literate person, a lawyer who was in that prison. And there were so many much poorer prisoners in jail with her. She was reading their petitions and she was basically trying to help them get out of jail, fighting for their rights from prison, in prison. I remember when I interviewed her, our conversation got interrupted by a phone call and she said, "I'm really sorry, but I have to take this, And then she came back and she said, "Sorry, yeah, but those were these 2 women from Bangladesh who were released from prison. And, that one of them has severe medical conditions. And now they're worried about how they're going to get back and what's going to happen to them. So this is what she's doing. She was doing the same work, fighting for the rights of poor people who are much less privileged than herself. She comes from a very elite background. She was born into a very privileged family, had US citizenship, raised in UK, born in Cambridge, USA. And at the age of 23 decided, I'm giving up all of these privileges and going to fight for the rights of minors in Chhattisgarh. These were the kinds of inspiring people who were in prison. And that's how they sustained themselves. And I guess they were also looking after each other and all the people they could around them. They're reading, they're writing. Yeah, so very inspiring. I end in the book with this line about democracy and where it's going to be preserved as we move forward. And in fact, it's going to be preserved in the most unexpected of places, including in prison.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. But
a good note to leave it on.
I thought so. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alpa Shah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you.
Alpa Shah is the award-winning author of Night March and In the Shadows of the State. She's written and presented for BBC Radio 4's Crossing Continents and from our own correspondent. She's a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics, and her latest book is The Incarcerations, Bhima Koregaon and the Search for Democracy in India. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.